something that's been hard to miss lately is the emergence of the woke corporation. You know them, the Gillettes, the Procter Gambles, the BHPs, that have a strong public position on toxic masculinity, transgender norms or climate change, but not on economic reform. That CEOs blindly follow these trends like a mob of sheep says more about their own need to earn their bonuses than delivering market value to shareholders. And it all has its origins in the United States, where corporate political correctness is ubiquitous, but where for the first time, there's now a bit of a reaction against these companies trying to bully people into whatever they say is correct. In the wake of claims of voter fraud, some US states are tightening up the rules for absentee votes, for votes used by people in a mail-in way, what we would know in Australia as postal votes, for example. In Republican-controlled Georgia, for instance, they've just passed a law requiring absentee voters to produce a driver's licence number or evidence such as an official document, a lease or a utility bill, let's say, when applying to vote by mail, rather than just a signature that then is compared with the signature on the ballot. So ID, pretty simple. Now, naturally, from President Joe Biden down, the Democrats are screaming at what they're now calling an affront to democracy. In Biden's case, in fact, he goes further, describing these clean ballot measures as Jim Crow laws, referring to post-Civil War rules put in place to stop African Americans from voting.
It's sick. Deciding in some states that you cannot bring water to people standing in line waiting to vote, deciding that you're going to end voting at 5 o'clock when working people are just getting off work, deciding that there will be no absentee ballots under the most rigid circumstances. It is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic.
My focus is on the issue of ID, and that was a pretty explosive reference there from the president, who says he wants to unite Americans, especially given that all anyone's trying to do here is ensure that democracy isn't rorted. But democracy isn't behind this outcry from the Democrats. What's motivating them here is the fact that these changes to the law in Georgia requiring ID for absentee voters will likely mean the end of ineligible voters voting. People such as illegal aliens, undocumented migrants. And to the Democrats, given this is a significant segment of their voter base, you can see why they want these laws scrapped and why they're mobilising the woke corporates in their campaign. Enter Coca-Cola, a global business headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, who, alongside fellow Georgia-based Delta Airlines, they're now trying to bully the Georgia legislature into withdrawing these new laws. Now, seriously, speaking out against ID for voters? Funny, I don't recall either of these corporates uttering a squeak against China for its treatment of minorities, but woke companies pick their battles, don't they? Now, in response, supporters of former President Donald Trump, they're threatening to boycott Coke products as retaliation for the company trying to cancel the decision democratically elected Georgia MPs. But with the President Biden's pointed intervention in this Jim Crow laws claim, the row is really escalating. A Major League Baseball game has already been moved out of Georgia, and now there are calls for the US Masters to be moved away from Augusta, also in Georgia, for the first time in its near 90-year history to punish this supposedly renegade state. My point here is not just about woke corporates that have forgotten that their job is to deliver a good product or service, treat their customers and their staff decently, make a profit for shareholders. My point is the strange reluctance of people who support democracy to make sure democracy is really what we get. I know it's been part of the charge from some, but I'm certainly not saying that last year's presidential election was fraudulent. But what I am saying is that any election won on the basis of invalid votes is undemocratic. So what's wrong with trying to ensure that the only people who vote are those genuinely entitled to do so? That's why it's so important that voter registration is done properly and that no one is allowed to vote who isn't properly qualified. It's something I feel really strongly about. And if you believe in democracy, then making sure it isn't susceptible to claims of corruption is critical to its support and its survival. If you're exercising the right to vote in a particular constituency, you should be able to demonstrate that you're eligible to vote there. If you're presenting to vote, it should be possible to check whether you've voted before in that ballot on that day. Asking people registering for an absentee vote to produce some kind of ID, a driver's licence, a social security card or a rates notice doesn't seem much of an imposition on the democratic process, but it's too much, as I'm telling you now, for US Democrats and their big business allies. Much the same is happening here, though, in Australia too. And it's something, isn't it, that we've raised here and discussed on the program in the past. Last December, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters brought down its report on the conduct of the 2019 election. Like a previous report on the previous election, it too recommended the production of photo ID in order to go on Australia's electoral rolls and the production of some form of ID in order to vote on polling day. I reckon it's all pretty straightforward and pretty obvious, you might think. To get on a plane, you've got to have your ID. These days, to sit down in a cafe, you have to register with a COVID app. So what's wrong with showing ID in order to vote? Well, a lot says the Labor Party. According to the Labor Minority Report, requiring ID would be a barrier for voting, quoting Labor, especially for people experiencing homelessness or domestic violence or Indigenous voters. Yet all of these people still need a licence to drive a car. Why should some form of ID be required to go on the roads, but not when it comes to vote? It's hard to avoid the conclusion that Labor is blasé about potential electoral fraud because it thinks that any voter misbehaviour would fall its way. In less than 12 months' time, there will be a federal election. And it's likely to be touch and go if recent polls are any indication. So for a PM looking for issues to demonstrate his party's values, this one, voter integrity, come on, Scott Morrison, it's a no-brainer. The Joint Standing Committee's majority report has been on the PM's desk for 5 months now, surely making it clear that the Liberals are the party of clean ballots would be strong ground for the PM to fight on, especially as it would force the Labor leader out to argue against it. Winning elections are not just about what you stand for and the policies that demonstrate it. It's also about framing the opponent, making it plain about what they stand for and what they don't. At some point, well before the next election, the government will have to start differentiating itself from Labor. If Labor won't fight on emissions reduction or new taxes, and the government can't fight on the quantum of public spending and debt anymore, well, what's left? Well, support for genuine democracy as opposed to Labor's anything goes? Well, I don't reckon that'd be a bad place to start, do you?